This is a crime investigation, and SLED, our state police agency, is handling that, and we are working with them to provide them any information and support.
Inside Stephen Smith's autopsy, homicide probe takes shocking turn after Alex Murdaugh conviction. Inside the autopsy, pathologist who oversaw Stephen Smith's second autopsy describes process. The exhumation of Stephen Smith's body and second autopsy was conducted quietly over the weekend in Tampa, Florida, as an independent group of forensic experts works to determine how and why the 19-year-old died in July 2015, and why his body ended up in the middle of a Hampton County, South Carolina road. Smith's death received renewed attention after Alex Murdaugh's conviction for the murders of his wife, Maggie, and son, Paul, last month. The Murdaugh name has loomed large over the investigation since Alex's brother, Randy Murdaugh, represented Stephen's father in a workers' compensation claim, and he and Alex showed up on the scene on Sandy Run Road the morning Stephen's body was found. Stephen was also a high school classmate of Buster Murdaugh, Alex's oldest son. No one in the Murdaugh family has been identified as a suspect. Dr. Michelle Duper, a retired forensic pathologist and former law enforcement officer who lives in South Carolina, oversaw Smith's exhumation and second autopsy. Dr. Duper told LAW and Crime Sidebar podcast that Smith's casket was removed from a vault at the cemetery and then driven by police escorts to Tampa, Florida. Once it arrived at a private lab, forensic pathologist Dr. Dan Schultz and forensic anthropologist Dr. Heather Walsh-Haney performed the examination. Not knowing what condition we might find the body in, we wanted to make sure that we had all of our bases covered, Dr. Duper said. The bones were in very good condition, and the body was as well. Dr. Duper said the team got all of the information needed from the second autopsy to determine the cause and manner of death. However, the final reports are incomplete, so she is unwilling to discuss the conclusions now. Dr. Duper called the first autopsy on Stephen Smith's body in July 2015 very professional and well done. The autopsy results have come under fire by some law enforcement officers and Smith's family, because pathologist Dr. Aaron Priestnell determined the 19-year-old died from head trauma caused by a vehicle and labeled the manner of death undetermined instead of homicide. Some investigators have criticized Dr. Priestnell's findings because she labeled the death a hit and run, because Smith's body was found in the road. An autopsy is an opinion of that person, the pathologist doing the exam. So it is an opinion, Dr. Duper noted. That was just an unfortunate statement, really. If we find a body in a swimming pool, we don't say they drowned because they were in the pool. We say they drowned because of the evidence. And again, that I think it was a misstatement. I think she probably regrets it. Dr. Duper also called the decision to perform a rape kit on Smith in 2015 thorough, given the circumstances under which his body was found. Duper said that would be done with a female or male during an autopsy. As the second autopsy was conducted, another part of the investigation began last weekend. Dr. Kenny Kinsey, a crime scene reconstruction expert who testified for the prosecution in Alex Murdaugh's double murder trial, has been retained to lead the independent investigation into Smith's death. Kinsey has been involved in more than 800 death investigations and has founded Kenny Kinsey and Associates LLC since the Murdaugh trial. Dr. Kinsey told the LAW and Crime Network's Anjanette Levy that he spent part of the weekend at the scene on Sandy Run Road, taking measurements and surveying the area where Smith's body was found nearly 8 years ago. I did a lot of walking in the woods, out of the woods, on the pavement. A lot of measurement, Dr. Kinsey said. I'd start over and get back in the vehicle and clock it again, and use some Google and satellite imagery. That kind of thing. Dr. Kinsey said there are 4 or 5 possibilities about what happened to Stephen Smith on July 8, 2015. Including the possibility that he was the victim of a hit-and-run driver. If somebody heard something or knows something, we're asking them to please come forward, because we can include it or exclude it, and then we can get back where we need to be. If it takes us in the right direction is helpful. If not, we can exclude it. Then we don't go down that avenue anymore, Dr. Kinsey said. Sandy Smith has raised more than $120,000 through a GoFundMe page to pay for the independent investigation and autopsy. Now, she's allocating $35,000 as a reward for information that leads to the arrest and conviction of the person or people who killed her son. Tips can be emailed to the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division or SLED at tips@sled.gov. SLED.sc.gov. Tips can be phoned to SLED by calling 800-3.737.9000 and asking for investigative services. Tips can also be emailed and called into the firm representing Sandy Smith, Bland Richter. Meanwhile, second autopsy done in unsolved South Carolina death probe. A second autopsy was completed this weekend on the exhumed body of a teenager found dead nearly 8 years ago on a South Carolina road. According to the family's lawyer, after the public attention surrounding Alex Murdaugh's murder trial boosted a mother's search for answers in the unsolved case. The mother's lawyers have said there is no evidence linking Stephen Smith's death to the Murdaugh family, and state investigators have remained tight-lipped since taking the case around the same time police said Murdaugh killed his wife and son. But speculation following the since disbarred lawyer's recent life sentence for those killings helped Sandy Smith raise more than $87,000 to have her son's body re-examined in an investigation that South Carolina Law Enforcement Division has said was never closed since the agency opened it in June 2021. Attorney Eric Bland, who is representing the family, said in a Sunday statement that this weekend was a bittersweet and trying time. With the second autopsy completed and the investigation unfolding, Bland said Stephen can really rest at ease. Stephen, for many, many years, I can only imagine, was not so much at peace in his grave, Bland said in a video. He probably was pounding on his coffin, saying to anybody who could hear, I was not hit by a car, but I was intentionally killed. And now we've told him we hear his voice. Bland's law firm announced Monday that Sandy Smith is offering a $35,000 reward for information leading to the identification and conviction of anyone responsible in her son's death. The announcement directed people to contact South Carolina Law Enforcement Division with any tips. South Carolina Law Enforcement Division Chief Mark Keel has assigned extra regional agents to the homicide investigation in hopes that knowledgeable parties might be more willing to speak now. According to a March 22 press release, Sandy Smith has long held that her son's death was no accident, but the result of a brutal beating. Bland has said, being young and gay in the South Carolina Low Country could not have been easy for Stephen Smith. The 19-year-old nursing student was found dead with head injuries and a dislocated arm bent behind him in the middle of a two-lane Hampton County road on July 8, 2015. Police said it appeared he was walking for help after running out of gas. His car was found not far from the body with the gas cap removed and his wallet still inside. The responding trooper didn't think it was a hit and run. The medical examiner who did the initial autopsy theorized his head was struck by the side mirror of a passing truck that did not stop. Bland has said Stephen Smith didn't make any calls on his cell phone, and his loosely tied shoes remained on his feet. The force of car wrecks often leaves people found without their shoes. The road also contained no skid marks or nearby debris, according to Ronnie Richter, another lawyer for the Smiths. Stephen Smith went to the same high school as Alex Murdaugh's surviving son, Uster, prompting rumors that the Murdaugh family was involved in Smith's death. Richter emphasized last week that the legal team has no evidence connecting the death in any way to Buster Murdaugh, who has recently denied any involvement amid claims that he called baseless. Here's what we know about the first Stephen Smith autopsy and the South Carolina pathologist who performed it. Before dawn on a steamy July day in 2015, Hampton County Coroner Ernie Washington was called to an area of pine trees and cornfields where a young man's body was sprawled in the middle of the road. He suffered blunt force trauma to the right side of his head, but few other apparent injuries. His loosely tied shoes were still on his feet, his iPhone and keys tucked in the pocket of his khaki shorts. Washington, a funeral home owner who had been coroner for 4 years, surmised this was no hit and run. He showed highway patrol officers and others arriving on the scene the spot where he believed a bullet had entered the young man's head. But 7 hours later, Dr. Aaron Presnell, now director of the pathology department at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston, came to a very different conclusion. 19-year-old Stephen Smith was not shot, but hit by a vehicle, her autopsy showed. Presnell's conclusion set off a dispute that lingers to this day. As the investigation moved among various law enforcement agencies, Hampton County Sheriff, Coroner, South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, Highway Patrol and its multidisciplinary accident investigation team, and now back to SLED, which says unequivocally they are investigating a homicide. SLED Chief Mark Keel takes it a step further. He believes Smith was murdered. The pathologist, if an arrest is made and a suspect tried, Presnell's interpretation of Smith's injuries will be crucial, perhaps mostly to a defense team. wanting to advance the idea that it was a hit and run, maybe an accident. 2 state agencies have criticized her findings, but Presnell has been silent. She did not respond to the state's request for comment, but a pathologist who she helped train did. Dr. Eric Eason said pathologists simply do not talk publicly about cases, unless in court, because it is the job of coroners to do so. Presnell, a Clemson University graduate, has been associated with Musk for her entire career. From medical school on, she has performed autopsies on some of South Carolina's biggest recent cases, including the 9 parishioners shot to death by a white supremacist at Charleston's Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in 2015. Presnell worked 4 days, including through the weekend, to complete the autopsies. Not surprising to anyone who knows her, she also worked the morning she got married in the early 2000s. Coincidentally, the Emmanuel probe was just 3 weeks before Smith's body was found. Presnell had 2 key findings in Smith's death: that his brain stem had separated from his spinal cord, and his skull had been fractured, which led her to rule the death was the result of a pedestrian versus vehicle crash. See Stephen Smith's autopsy here. Such injuries can only be caused by a vehicle hitting a pedestrian at a high rate of speed, said Eason, a pathologist who has spent most of his career at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and Cook County, Chicago, Medical Examiner's Office. He returned to Charleston to work as a consultant at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. The head gets whipped backward, he said. The impact has to be really severe. That would rule out being hit by a baseball bat, as some have speculated. Eason said determining that Smith was hit by a vehicle does not rule out that he was intentionally killed. He has pushed back on people who have questioned Presnell's findings, calling her a doctor with great integrity, who would not be swayed by anyone or anything other than what she sees at autopsy. She would not risk her medical license, he said. Another doctor who the state reached out to for her opinion on the autopsy report disagreed with Eason's assessment. Dr. Aaron Kimmerell, a pathologist and associate professor at the University of South Florida, said a brainstem injury may occur in high-speed accidents, falls, or other forms of blunt injuries. They can also be misdiagnosed when damage occurs to the brainstem during the removal of the brain at autopsy. She said to determine with certainty how Smith died would require reconstructing the cranial fractures to see the point of impact, the shape of the object that hit him, and the number of injuries. That is the work of a forensic anthropologist, she said. A second autopsy. Smith's mother, Sandy, has raised more than $125,000 for a second autopsy, which was recently completed. She wanted to avoid anyone from her associated with Musk, she wrote on her GoFundMe page. Her lawyers, Eric Bland and Ronnie Richter, assembled a team to take another look, led by Dr. Dan Schultz, president and chief pathologist for a private company in Tampa called Final Diagnosis. Also on the team were Dr. Michelle Duper, a retired forensic pathologist in Columbia who was the medical examiner in Miami, and also a professor, and Dr. Heather Walsh-Haney, a forensic anthropologist at Florida Gulf Coast University in Fort Myers, Florida. The team also includes a noted witness from the Alex Murdaugh trial, Kenny Kinsey, who worked as an investigator for the Orangeburg Sheriff's Office. He told Court TV he is considering 4 or 5 scenarios about how Smith died, including a hit-and-run scenario, but did not offer specifics. He also said he is counting on the new autopsy to help lead him to a conclusion. Smith's body was exhumed the previous weekend, driven to Florida, autopsied and returned for reburial at Gooding Cemetery in Crocketville near Hampton last Sunday. His mother posted on social media a photo of her at the grave. Duper told Court TV that the doctors were able to perform a full autopsy and got the information they had hoped to find. She would not say specifically what was uncovered at the request of SLED. The Highway Patrol. Highway Patrol investigators have said that they suspected from the beginning that Smith was murdered and perhaps killed elsewhere. They point to the fact that there were no pieces of a vehicle or broken glass at the scene, and that Smith's shoes were still on his feet, uncommon in situations where someone is hit by a car or truck. Eason said he has seen both shoes on and shoes off when someone is hit by a vehicle. Smith's mother Sandy has also said it was highly unlikely that her son would be walking down a dark highway in the middle of the night. He would have been afraid. Also, his car, which was out of gas, was about 2 miles away with his wallet inside. Todd Proctor, the lead investigator for the Highway Patrol in the Smith case, wrote in his report that he went to Musk to talk to Presnell about her findings in August 2015, but was met with a negative tone. She was busy and he didn't have an appointment. She asked why we did not think it was a vehicle strike, and I explained to her that we had no evidence of this individual being struck by a vehicle. I asked her if someone with a baseball bat could do that, and she stated no. When I probed further saying what about someone in a moving car with a bat, she stated, well, I guess it's possible. Eason said he knows how busy the Musk pathology lab can get. More than 1,000 autopsies are done there each year by a handful of pathologists. In his report, Proctor wrote that the coroner agreed it was not a hit and run, that later he said he would go along with Presnell's opinion. Washington could not be reached for comment. Proctor also wrote in his report something puzzling. The coroner stated that he had made contact with the pathologist, Dr. Presnell, and she stated that she would be willing to change her report to read however he wanted. None of the three could be reached for comment, so it's unclear what the statement means. Eason suggested it's likely a reference to the coroner's personal preference of the wording of the medical terminology used in the autopsy report. Coroners sign death certificates in South Carolina and have the final say on what is included. The second autopsy, the investigation team assembled by Smith's lawyers, hope the additional information from the autopsy will put pressure on whoever is responsible for Smith's death. Any number of people have been accused on social media, but SLED has been mum. The 2015 Highway Patrol report lists a number of names, including Buster Murdaugh, whose father was convicted of murdering his mother and brother and sentenced to life in prison last month. Buster Murdaugh released a statement denying any involvement. He was a high school classmate of Smith. Eason said he believes the confusion over the first autopsy began when Coroner Washington said emphatically it was a gunshot wound. More typically, a coroner's information to the pathologist would be more vague, that the body was found in the road, possibly a hit and run, possibly a gunshot victim. That's where the chaos began, he said.